I thought I'd start by giving an overview of my studio practice. So I trained in Edinburgh and then moved to London about the age of 30 and lived in central London for a bit and then moved out in order to have a bit of space. And I have a studio at home. And so for the last 10 years, I've been in Hertfordshire in a house just by some fields and with horses running around in the sticks, basically. But blessed to have a space to work in. So I just thought I'd begin by showing you a few photos of how I've used this space since moving in here. I use the wall of the space to gather objects and to create test pieces. I work predominantly with fibre-based materials, things that I can manipulate with my hands. I use a sewing machine, pliers, worked with wire, all sorts of different materials, but I quite like the kind of humble materials that I can work with and manipulate quite simply myself without using heavy equipment. I collect a lot of found objects and I respond very much to my collections. So you can see that over the years I've worked with different materials in different ways. I use a lot of repetition in my work. So there is a kind of modular, repetitious, rhythmic quality to my making. I like to kind of get lost inside the surfaces. I often work with different materials. I'll work with something and then I'll kind of move on to something quite different, like paper mache if I've used wool before. So I do like to change things up quite a lot. And I like the idea of experimentation. So not really knowing what's going to happen next. I've worked with recently synthetic materials. This is a piece that I made for Facebook London offices, which is really fabulous in the studio, far too big for the studio. But often I'm filling the space and then really only installing the final work, if it's very big, for the first time in situ in an exhibition. Because the ceilings are too short. So I really like to kind of spread out and experiment and really use the wall like a kind of surface of experimentation. So often the artworks blend with the found objects that I'm responding to. And yeah, it's a sort of playroom essentially. A serious playroom at times. So you can see the kind of range of colours and ideas and forms that I've been working through in the last few years. Because I have this intimate relationship with this space, we wanted to reflect that in the exhibition. And so this wall is kind of my kind of blank canvas, my sketchbook page, my surface for collections. So I created this composition for the exhibition at St Albans Museum to try and show the kind of energy of the studio, including early objects, early significant works and found objects, but also really current things. So in the center of this image, you can see the print that was for flamenco, which is a very recent work. So things literally for the exhibition were coming direct from the studio and straight into the gallery alongside archive objects. So there are some test pieces in here that are new pieces that I will be developing in the next 6 months as well. And there's a little key showcasing what each object is and what it means or where it was derived from. So one of the important objects in the cabinet is the Edinburgh College of Art Tapestry Department Blue Book, which was the pre-digital handbook for all students at the Art College. And I trained BA and MA in tapestry at Edinburgh College of Art under the directorship of Maureen Hodge, the first female weaver at the Edinburgh Tapestry Studios, now known as the Dovecot Studios, and she ran the department for almost 40 years, and it was just an incredible experience to train there with that very unique community. Formerly in the design school, the department moved into the School of Fine Art, and so my training is in fine art, but fine art, mixed media, tapestry, textiles. So this blue book has a guide to make all sorts of things, focusing on fibre-based media, but also things like how to make a light box, an incredible book list, all sorts of tips on hanging shows, things like that. So gradually this blue book was added to by staff members over the years and became the kind of guide to art life, essentially. This was the first tapestry I wove. Based on a Pierre Bonnard painting. Each student in the first year at Tapestry were given a segment of a Pierre Bonnard painting, and we all had a go at weaving our segment, and then they were put together to create a kind of whole. So I love this little piece. I haven't woven a lot of tapestries, I must say, but I really am fond of my very first one. Alongside that, I've included in the cabinet this one, which is this little bit of tapestry, which is made using my hair when I used to dye it red. And this is my Laura Ashley childhood bedroom wallpaper, but woven with my hair. So often there is the theme of the domestic space, but also the body within my work. It's not always really obvious, but in this case, yes, this theme of identity and my own life and my own kind of personal history kind of comes through the work from time to time. I created these drawings when I was doing the MA at Edinburgh College of Art, and this is quite a significant drawing in terms of then how my work developed later. So working with these sort of strand-like threaded elements. I didn't know at that point that I would end up making lots of padded strands in the next 20 years, but that seems to be what I have ended up doing. So that's Love Heart. And I, at the time, was embroidering a lot of my drawings. So this little embroidery is in the exhibition, a hand embroidery. I like to work in different ways. I get bored really easily. So I like to change up what I'm doing quite often. And concurrent to working with stitch and drawing, I was also working with installation during my MA and my BA performance. And I've always been fascinated by structures and repetition, but not just in 2 dimensions. So this paper piece I've included in the cabinet because it's an early work, but it still has a meaning and a kind of relevance now to some of my recent work in the exhibition. I used a lot of coloured light, and I'd project slides onto the objects that I made and then would photograph them in different ways to try and conjure different emotional atmospheres. This is a piece called Rain, inspired by an old rocking horse that we have in the family, a Victorian rocking horse, whose reins were completely disintegrating, the leather was coming apart, and I recreated it in padded fabric. And actually, I'd forgotten all about this until fairly recently, and this represents one of the first padded works that I made. But I rather like it for its kind of, it's rather badly kind of stitched, but I rather like the kind of heavy energy of it. I've also included in the cabinet collaborative work. So over the years, I've worked on public engagement projects with other people. I've worked collaboratively. I've worked with other artists, and I've worked with other manufacturers. This piece was made in collaboration with the artist Giuseppe Coco, who's an Italian artist who I met doing the exhibition Mini Art Textile about 10 years ago, and I was responding to a painting that I saw in his studio. He had painted this from a natural history image, an old book that he had, a black and white image, but I was very struck by the sculptural quality of the image, the object in the painting, and so decided to replicate it in my own materials. I've been fortunate to work with some fantastic weavers. I worked with Dash and Miller, and they created a special edition for me for an exhibition, Entangled Threads of Making, where I showed my large piece Margate knot, which is in the exhibition. And they responded to my little paintings of an idea for textiles and created these exquisite little samples on the hand looms. They're based in Bristol, and they're just, you know, absolute experts in the field, hugely creative in terms of what they make, and prolific in their output. So I'm just completely blown away by their work, and it was just fantastic to have my first woven textile created by Emma Loughton at Dash and Miller. So this was available as an edition for that exhibition, so I thought it was nice to kind of include it here. They recommended that I go up to Leeds University to see Lindsey-Waterton Taylor, who had a 3D loom, basically, with money from the EU. So she has set up the 3D Weaving Innovation Centre at the University of Leeds, and I was very fortunate to work with her and her team, and they created a series of samples for me that are 3D woven objects. So these are really exciting, cutting edge objects, and I have formed a friendship relationship with one of the weavers at Leeds University, Hannah Robson, who's a fantastic artist, and she and I are developing further research, and she is weaving pieces, drawings that I'm developing. So we're kind of developing another project. So I really like to sort of make friends with interesting, talented people, but also in a way my career is just sort of like following little leads, wandering down this avenue and seeing who's there, and kind of making friends, but then trying to collaborate if the chemistry's right or if it feels like it's an interesting thing to do. So it is really important to me to kind of follow my nose a little bit. This is the 3D Innovation Centre, Weaving Innovation Centre at the University of Leeds. So incredible. Incredible equipment to have here in the UK. So I was really stunned to be able to have access and to witness this machine in operation. What's going on? Oh, something's gone wrong with my, I don't know what happened there. Sorry about that, it was beeping at me. So other influences that are really important: my parents, my mother and my grandmother were brilliant makers. My mother, you can see here, we're at a family wedding. I'm the little baby in the picture. She had fabulous clothes, and so when I was a baby in the mid-70s, I would open her wardrobe and see incredible fabrics, 60s silks stacked up like amazing clashing pleats. You know, just the sliding door of the wardrobe was enough for me. It was like an extraordinary kind of beautiful experience to see all of her clothing kind of all lined up in the wardrobe. She was a dressmaker, and she was really kind in a way over the years to let me kind of have her clothes and chop them up, essentially. Not all of them. Thankfully, I didn't chop them all up. I still have some of her 60s dresses intact, and 70s dresses. But she had created for me as a baby, a child, this patchwork ball, and I kept this, and I love the form of this even as an adult. I think it's a really beautiful object because of its kind of pure form, but also its softness. And the ball has a bell inside, a muffled bell, but a really nice stainless steel bell. And I was just always really fascinated by this sculpturally. So I was teaching at the art college after studying, and I decided to make three-dimensional work inspired by this patchwork ball. So this is Bad Blood. Oh my gosh, there's something, it's not, the scroll isn't working. Okay. This is Bad Blood, which is inspired by the patchwork ball my mother had made. And instead of it being single balls, the balls are connected like kind of soft molecules. I had been very interested in science at school, and was always fascinated to draw, you know, test tubes, tripods, all the equipment of an experiment, you know, in biology class, looking through microscopes and then drawing what I was seeing, the sort of cellular structures and plant structures. So I have always had that sort of imagery in my head as a sort of, yeah, imagery that I found really interesting: diagrams, mapping of things, describing things visually and in simple terms. And so Bad Blood kind of harks back to my interest in science, and also is just a development of that object that I like so much. I did discover recently some drawings from that period of me musing on this object, which is quite interesting, having not seen them for a long time. But I quite like the idea of sequences. So, you know, here it's very simple. It's just the red ball becomes black, but bit by bit. So it's almost like a little animation going along. The time that I made this piece, I had an experience of surgery, and I was really interested. It was vascular surgery, so it was to do with blood and blood supply and my vessels. And so I think I must have been just kind of, yeah, dreaming in that space. And I've always been fascinated by the idea of dreaming and the subconscious. And what was really interesting to me when I had an operation was the idea that you don't remember anything. It's like a dreamless sleep. I remember going out under anaesthetic and then coming back, and there was nothing in that space. So bad blood has these associations with my own experience of surgery, of an operation, but also it is a playful work. It is, you know, it moves, it's heavy, it's a bit clumsy and awkward, it tips over, it's a soft object. So the name Bad Blood was really a pet name for it, but it was also the idea of something misbehaving. So I do quite like the idea of toys and play, and there's a sort of humour in the work, but a seriousness as well. And this piece could also be interpreted as bad blood between people, or bad blood as in something going wrong in the body. And I'm very conscious of the amazing microscopic kind of power of the body, and what we can and can't understand, and what we do and don't see under the skin. So that's a kind of preoccupation, but it's not necessarily the only reading of that work. So this is the exhibition. So it's really nice to have Bad Blood as this very early work in amongst much more recent pieces. It kind of strikes a chord with me to see it sort of nestled in there. That was entirely hand-stitched patchwork, so the surface area of it is quite significant to be hand-stitched. And I remember making it and thinking, gosh, this is so labour-intensive. You know, if I wanted to make anything bigger, it would take me so long. And so I did, after that, start using the sewing machine to make my padded pieces, because it was quicker, and it allowed me to really expand the scale. Just checking where we are. Oh yes, I'm doing okay for time. That's good. Sorry, I just need to get into my rhythm of how long I'm spending on each section. The exhibition has 2 cabinets, so it's really lovely to be able to show different kinds of work alongside the sculptural pieces. I trained in Edinburgh Tapestry BA and MA, and then I went on to teach in the department alongside Maureen Hodge and the other members of staff in the department, which was an amazing experience. And then when I turned sort of 30, I decided to move on and move to London. So around that time, I had a context in Edinburgh. I was sort of part of the art scene, but then I moved to London and I kind of didn't know anyone. I hadn't trained there, and it was sort of starting again. And it's very nice for me to include these gouache paintings at this point, because I made these when I first moved to London and I was kind of a bit adrift, really. I didn't know what was going to happen next. And I was focusing through these works on the traditional media used to create textile design. So using gouache paint onto hot pressed Fabriano paper. So this series were created around the same time. So this is Zigzag. I've been looking a lot at textile design, and always have, you know, back to my mother's clothing, and just being fascinated by textiles always, and really interested in repetition and what it can do to you sort of psychologically, how it can make you feel, but also almost that potential of movement within pattern and pattern making. That the work might be physically still, but that it isn't visually fixed. So this idea that you're looking at something, but that your eye is moving around constantly and is never stopping in one place. I've always really liked that idea. This is straw, which anyone who grew up in the 80s would have been familiar with the bendy straw. I'm not sure when they were invented, but there certainly were a lot of them around in the 80s. So I was thinking of these in terms of textile design, perhaps, but also just structures or other sculptural pieces. But it was very nice just to sort of focus in on the sort of small scale and get into the detail. What we haven't included in the exhibition is my other work in in film or in embroidery very much. So alongside these soft sculptural works, which is the main focus of the exhibition, I have worked with different media and time-based media as well. So this idea of movement and sequencing is a kind of recurring interest. This piece, Crescent, is a kind of joyful, dynamic, over-the-top sort of patterned surface inspired partly by childhood wallpapers, 70s wallpapers, and also by this piece that I made earlier. Fairly soon after I made Bad Blood, I made this piece called Shoulder, which is made out of shoulder pads. So I'd started to collect objects from charity shops and sort of building up padded surfaces and artworks with those objects. So I've included these aren't, this piece isn't in the exhibition, but just to show how I'm sort of moving from 2D to 3D, sort of bringing imagery. Imagery keeps coming back and it recurs, and still now the same kinds of images or forms or shapes will keep coming back. This piece, Coil, was another one in this series that I developed in that first year in London. It's quite interesting for me to look at this now because since I created this drawing, I've made sculptural installation pieces that are closely related to it, but I wasn't really kind of thinking about this drawing when I made them. I did have a bit of an obsession with telephone cables, big black thick telephone cables when I was a child, you know, sitting on the phone with my as a teenager with my friend, just coiling the cable around my fingers. I love the sort of tactility of a spring or a coil, I think, and this sort of shape does come back into my work quite often. Around the age of 30, I had a baby, and that changed things, made things complicated and wonderful. But I kept things going. I kept making small artworks, and I was still exhibiting. I was exhibiting with artist friends in Edinburgh, and I continued my drawing, you know, when I could, and I kept making these smaller works. And I just found this the other day, an old sketchbook page, but I started making these small boxed works using padded fabric again. And this is Bloom, and then a little element of stripe. And after being in a small flat for a while with no room at all, we then moved into a house with an old garage that had been converted, but had the ceiling, things like the ceiling was leaking, there was no floor, it was a bit of a disaster area, but managed to put a couple of Velux, it was very dark as well, was able to put a couple of Veluxes in the roof, and then it was transformed into this perfect little studio space. So I was able to finally spread out and start making some bigger work again. So this studio space has really grown, and it's given me so much kind of freedom to experiment and to work on a larger scale. So this is sort of early days in the studio, and you can see Bloom and Stripe there growing on the wall. And it's strange because I had literally come up with the idea for them in my sketchbook at the same time, and then they've kind of stayed together. I don't always show them together, but they kind of belong together, and I quite like the idea of what I make first and then what I make next, and I do see them as being interrelated quite often. It's like my train of thought, you know, where I'm moving from one thing to another. So this is Bloom and Stripe in the studio. And I like the idea of this potential of movement. So Bloom is fixed, everything's stitched down, it's very fixed together. But Stripe is made up of lots of different elements. And actually with Stripe, it was a really freeing work because Bloom had been very painstaking. The ends of each element of the yellow piece were hand stitched and stuffed and then stitched together and then stitched to a backing board. And it was incredibly tight to do. And after I made it, I kind of wanted to spread out and just relax a bit. And so Stripe's actually hand painted padded fabric. And the shapes for Stripe were just made by me just drawing lines onto cloth and then turning them into shapes and creating padded forms. So it was quite a free work. And you can see here in the exhibition, they are nestled together rather nicely on the wall there. beyond beyond that work, I was still collecting objects, and this is cup inspired by, well, made out of the underwires from braziers, and this was created earlier, but it's, yes, I've just put it in this order because I don't know why. And this was created earlier when I was still in Edinburgh, but I was really fascinated by these underwires from braziers because they were like beautiful pieces of jewellery, and they had these coloured ends. And I realised that they were colour coded for the different sizes of the bras. So I collected them all from charity shops and asked people to kind of send me your old bras, you know, I want the wires. And so I created this work cup from all of these underwires. And then I started making these drawings of these objects. So this was still when I was in Edinburgh. Yeah, the genesis of this next piece was at that point. And I made drawings of the underwires, and I was thinking, well, you know, how can I develop these? And the first thing I thought is, I'll just get my fabric and my sewing machine and I'll just make one in cloth. And then I realized they could be tied together. And I thought, oh, now that's interesting. They're soft, so I can tie them together in any way that I want. So I made digital drawings of them, and I thought, ooh, this could be really exciting, you know, like really big or really dynamic, and I could create all sorts of different patterns. And so I made these pieces, which became the first knot piece. And they were lovely elements to kind of play with, and even piled up, they look really fantastic, I thought. And the original concept for the knot series was to make them in a repeat pattern. So that was the idea. And the first piece was made, and you can just about see a sort of soft pattern across the edges here. So I like this idea. Again, it's repetitious, but it's not exact. So it's got this kind of pinning and folding going on within the surface. The nice thing about the knot piece was that it could be installed as an object as well, but obviously most of the knots are buried inside the object. But I found it really exciting, again, this flexibility, like with Bad Blood and Stripe, that it would look different in different settings. In the end, I more often than not showed it in a random pattern, because I liked the repeat pattern, but often if I went to a show, there wouldn't be time to do a repeat. And I actually quite liked the kind of energy of the randomness of the elements. It seemed to still have a coherence, but just a sort of more of a fluctuation in the surface. This piece is in a law firm in Birmingham in their client's lounge, and I was invited to do an exhibition by Karen Wright, a curator at Margate Turner Contemporary, and this was this was with artists like Louise Hesse, Sheila Hicks, Hannah Regan. It was an amazing exhibition, and I couldn't believe that I was being invited to join it in. And she requested the knot piece, and I said, I'm really sorry, it's on permanent display, but I'll make another one. And I said it had always been, that first one had always been a test piece, really, for a larger work. And so I made the Margate knot, which is in the exhibition Fibre and Form. But this time, instead of making it all myself, I paid local women to make the elements so that we could create something much bigger. And this piece had more colours. So the piece in the exhibition Fibre and Form is the Margate knot. So it's significantly bigger. And instead of the original, which had 1,000 elements, this has 2,000 elements, and they are physically much larger in scale. So that was a really fantastic project, because it was my first experience of working with assistants, having help to make, because once the work starts getting bigger, there's only so much I can physically do in a particular amount of time. So that was a real eye-opener for me, asking for support in the making. So here it is in the Fibre and Form exhibition at St Albans Museum and Gallery. And alongside it, I have created a work called Ribbon Chain. Just like my interest in coils and repetitious shapes, like and jewel and yeah, just appeals to me, the idea of something that moves and shifts all the time, but that has a kind of logical structure to it as well, and a sort of symmetry. I had earlier, when I had my son and I was making these small works like Bloom, I had made another piece called Coil, a bit like the telephone wires, but this work had kind of come back to mind as well. And I was sort of thinking about the difference between a link and a coil, and I started making test pieces in the studio, thinking about different kinds of shapes that could interlink. Having worked with the knot piece, which was these strands that were tied, I started thinking about other ways that things could join together. And so ribbon chain developed from digital proposals and test pieces in the studio that was sort of hanging on the wall for a while, being ignored. And eventually there was this sort of moment after I finished Entangled Threads and Making to kind of get back to the studio. And so I started developing this work, and it just grew on the wall of the studio and sort of took its own shape. But this piece is rather nice because it's coils, it's chain links that turn into a coil, that then turn into a chain again, then turn into a coil. So it can expand and contract, but it can also sort of fold up and compress in a really interesting way. I made some ribbons, handmade ribbons as well, to sort of have a kind of contrast in colour and punch out the surface. And I embellished the surface of the work with these ribbons. So essentially this piece can be installed in many different ways, but I often stick to the original composition that I come up with in the studio, because it has a kind of immediacy of the very first moment that I made it. So I've actually installed it in the exhibition as it was first created in the studio. Excuse me, my finger's slipping. But just to show you, when the work comes off the wall, it collapses. So it's sometimes really difficult to get it to look like what it did in the studio. Sometimes it's not difficult, sometimes it's pretty easy, but sometimes it's really not. So this caused me the most problem in installing fibre and form. I thought it would be straightforward, but trying to kind of get the exact kind of balance of shapes was really tricky. But it's rather nice like this. So I like seeing the work in different states. And potentially I could remove all the ribbons and then reinstate them and reinstate the piece in a completely different way on another occasion. Now we've come to the National Festival of Making. I was really lucky to be selected by the team at the National Festival of Making for this project, Art in Manufacturing. It happens in Blackburn every year. It's a brilliant festival celebrating manufacturing in the area. So the team at Art Manufacturing, they team up artists with fabricators and manufacturers locally. So I was teamed up with, so there were 5 of us, I think, that year. It varies from year to year. And I was teamed up with Forbo Flooring, who create carpet tiles. So I had this incredible experience of watching the tufting process of carpet. And I hadn't really, I don't know why I hadn't thought about it, but carpet tufting is actually created by machines that have hundreds of needles lined up with threads that basically sew loops into top cloth, and then they add bitumen and another kind of latex, I think, to kind of create the hard carpet tiles. But it was just fascinating to go from my studio, my tiny sewing machine, to seeing industrial manufacture and these huge rolls of yarn and amazing piles of cloth. And I was really struck by the threads that I saw hanging in the space and the changeover fabrics when they keep the machines running to run from one colour to the next. So there was all sorts of visual inspiration, repeat patterns, discs, circles, lines of threads, amazing, enormous bits of metal, but then with tiny kind of eyelets where tiny threads are kind of coming through. It's really kind of epic. And a fantastic experience. And my job was to respond to the manufacturing environment, and in quite a short space of time, like 3 months or something, create new work. So this was really challenging, but brilliant. And having worked with a lot of natural fibres, I was now working with synthetic crimp yarn. So I brought back all these amazing materials to the studio and developed three major works and a smaller one. And the piece in the exhibition is Offcut Ends. So this is made with synthetic crimp yarn, and I attached metal washers to the ends of the threads because they were crimping up in the heat of the studio. And so the washers were the only way I could kind of keep the plumb line. But I love that the washers kind of echo the metal of the machinery in the factory. So it's really lovely to bring in this work here in the exhibition. It's a bit like a kind of stretched pointillism, and I've always been interested in pointillism. So it's really fantastic to kind of see it in a beautiful space like this. And now on to my Huguenot ancestors. I've been interested in weaving, and I've worked with weavers, and part of the reason for this is obviously I trained in a tapestry department. I've always been interested in textiles, but when I was in my 20s, my father phoned me one day and he said he'd been looking at some family archive material, and he said, did you know that we've got French Huguenot ancestors who were silk weavers in the 1700s in our family? And I was like, no, I didn't know that. How amazing, and tell me more. And yeah, we kind of looked into some old family documents, and my auntie Eve had written these long sort of family history stories. She jotted down the family stories essentially. And Douglas, my grandfather, had also written stories of his childhood and his ancestors. And we have this incredible kind of pairing of documents of the family ancestry. My grandfather, Douglas, worked on one of the first computers at Walthamstow Town Hall as well. So there's a really interesting kind of link between the first punch cards of modern computing being in my possession from my grandfather Douglas, on the same family line as the French Huguenots, and also the history of weaving and the history of the jacquard loom, which used punch cards. And these are jacquard loom punch cards that Zoe Acketts kindly gave me from Bristol Weaving Mill when I was visiting as artist in residence at Dash and Miller. So I was just so interested to sort of see that, yes, in the family line, we've got the weavers, and also there were descendants of the weavers were fancy trimmings manufacturers, and also my grandfather's interest in computing, and then my interest in pointillism and painting and digital imaging as well. So that's become a sort of long-term interest and influence in my work. This drawing, Mesh, is inspired by, I created after I made Bad Blood, so inspired by the idea of the skin and how it can repair itself, but it also relates to mesh in terms of computer-aided design and 3D design. So I often refer back to grids and meshes and pointillism and pixelation in my practice. It's sort of a recurring theme. And it just comes up from time to time. You know, I made this a few years ago, this paper piece out of paper straws, and it echoes this mesh drawing that I created a long time ago. I'm showing you these because they relate to Mesh, which is a new piece that I've made with Arts Council funding. I was interested in the stories of my Huguenot ancestors. Apparently, when they fled from France, often the women came first. When families fled from France, the women came first with the children before the men. And I heard tell from a Huguenot walk that I did in Spitalfields by one of the experts that the women would come and they would often sleep in barrels in the streets with their children. And I thought this was extraordinary, this idea of sleeping in a barrel, and it made me think of sort of petticoats and boning and clothing as well for some reason. And so I was very struck by this idea of the mother protector and this idea of a kind of cocoon around the body. And I'd been looking a lot at silkworms and silk weaving and the growth of silkworms in kind of basket work. So there's all these different ideas kind of blending together. And then there's this idea of mesh and cages. And so I was thinking about these containers as I was working towards the exhibition, and thinking about the idea of the mother as the protector. And I had these drawings in my sketchbooks, and I wasn't really sure where it was going, partly inspired by clothing and boning in clothing. I just had a kind of feeling about colour and atmosphere and emotion. And I had been given these antique clothes by my father-in-law, and I'd been really taken by the colour and the fading of the materials. And I also have a piece of bark cloth in the studio that I've been inspired by. And these objects sort of related to each other in terms of their aged appearance and the softness of the colours, which is quite different to my which is different to some of my more highly coloured visual pieces. This proposal was actually something I created very quickly, as you could probably tell, at the very early stages of working towards this exhibition. And actually I looked at it again and I thought how interesting that this was the sort of atmosphere I thought I was going to create with this new work. And I kind of have made something that relates to that proposal, but it is quite different in the end as to how it's been produced. So I started creating this triangular mesh, essentially, but using my favourite materials, cotton, and this time painting and block printing the surface to create a kind of soft texture. And I realised I could tie these objects that I was making together with these strands of fabric. And so this piece mesh started to build in the studio and became rather cage-like. And I had thought of making it circular, but it just seemed to lend itself very much to the wall. And I loved the way that as I was creating it, it was sort of clinging to the wall, and it actually hovers off the floor. So rather than a sculptural work, I mean, a floor-based work, the piece in the end became a wall piece. Oh, I just skipped again, sorry. But what's really amazing about it is that it floats off the floor. So it's quite hard to gauge the kind of complete effect of it. But it is rather beautiful and emotional. So for me, it conjures all of those things I was looking at, the kind of old clothes, the delicacy of the material, the fragility, but yet it's a really strong structure. So in the middle of the image, almost, there's one piece that's hovering just above the floor, about 3 millimeters. And since I installed it, it hasn't sagged at all. It's still floating 3 millimeters off the floor, even though it's coming off the wall quite far. So I've been really amazed at how strong it is, even though it's tied together just section by section. It's like a sort of set of ladders, but the elements are completely soft. There's just padding inside them. So I'm really excited about this piece. And it kind of, to me, speaks of, yes, a sort of vulnerability, but a strength at the same time. And that relates to my ideas of the mother, the protector, the feminine perhaps, but also that notion of skin and surface, and the surface of the body. Alongside mesh, I had funding to make 2 new works from the Arts Council, which is just amazing and so freeing and so brilliant. So I'm so grateful to the Arts Council for their continued support in developing my work. This piece is called Rosettes and was inspired by the fancy trimmings that my ancestors would have made. So a kind of magnified form of passementerie, embellishments for clothing. I was told that the Huguenot silk weavers were so poor that they would make embellishments for clothing on the side, alongside weaving for the master weavers in the 1700s. They would make rosettes, birds and butterflies for ladies to fix to their clothes or to give as gifts. And I love this idea of this sort of, yes, this embellishment, this extra, but also that this was their way of earning a living or surviving. So I started making these rosettes in the studio. And as before with mesh, the piece grew and grew on the wall. And I had intended to paint it and have ribbons hanging from it, and it be quite intense color-wise, but as it grew on the wall, it was just so beautiful and uplifting. And bearing in mind, I made mesh and rosette during COVID, basically. There was something so stunning and soft about this white fabric that I found myself thinking, I might have to change direction, because if I suddenly paint it all and then I don't like it as much, you know, what will I do? So I decided in the end to punctuate the work with moments of colour. And I don't know if you've ever picked up a seed head on our COVID walks. We've all probably been doing a lot of that, and to feel how strong it is and connected in the centre it is, but then how suddenly it can disperse. Well, these objects, these rosettes, are stitched in the middle, but they're not fixed very solidly, so they do flatten and collapse as well. So they do have a kind of softness and a vulnerability that's close to things I've experienced in nature and with flowers and plants. I decided to create some ribbons and attach them by sort of bandaging them around parts of the strands to create that kind of movement with the colour. And this was the composition that I created in the studio. And so I wanted to sort of put that back into the exhibition exactly as it was. It's quite difficult to get them to look like this. It's strange, they seem very simple, but actually to get the composition and the movement and the flow of each object it takes time to kind of finesse, and I have to kind of really get into them visually so that you have that really lovely soft gentle flow. So here I am in the exhibition, just to show you a bit of scale, and rosette and mesh were made with each other in mind, let's put it that way, because they both are about my ancestors to a certain extent, and they are very beautiful when they're read next to each other in the exhibition. So just a few more installation shots so that you can get a sense of the whole show. But I love the juxtaposition in the exhibition. So you're seeing one work through another, you know, your peripheral vision, you have part of a piece here and then you're reading something else at the same time. You know, I'm really delighted with how the show looks, and I'm very grateful to the install team for creating such a beautiful space, and to the curators for being so considerate and giving me enough time to install. And I had a wonderful a technician, Lee, who helped me install the work, who was just amazing, because these pieces take time to hang and to get really, really right. Yeah, he was a joy to work with, and I shall be asking him to help me on every show I do from now on. And another person I must thank is the curator, Anne Coxon, who is curator of international art at Tate Modern, who kindly has marked this very significant moment in my career with a beautiful bit of text. So this text is available from my website and also from the museum, and so I urge you to read it. It's on my website. It's also on my LinkedIn link, my Instagram link tree. So perhaps Elizabeth she might forward the link to the text at the end of the session, so you can read it. So thank you very much to Anne and to Inna and Annabel for curating the show, and to Elizabeth and Hannah for hosting this evening. And thank you for listening.